If you want to give yourself a real treat, if you want to experience that feeling of just having discovered a new gem in the city of Chicago, visit the Chicago Historical Society at 1601 North Clark Street. It is a treasure trove. The museum has a new leader, and he is with us today. Our guest today actually arrived here early last year, just after the snow, bringing with him a major new traveling exhibition called The American Presidency, A Glorious Burden. The exhibit is based on a permanent exhibition at the Smithsonian Institution. Our guest today considers Chicago an historian's dream because, he says, it is a city shaped by history, by its history, and a city that embraces history. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome to the City Club of Chicago the president of the Chicago Historical Society, Lonnie Bunch. Lonnie? All yours. All right. And again, the questions are up there.
All right. Thank you all very much. Jay, thank you so much for your kind comments. I have to be honest, as somebody new to the city of Chicago, I really am struck by how friendly people have been and how much they've embraced my family and myself. And so I just wanted to publicly thank you for making somebody who was once one of those people who knew nothing about Chicago other than O'Hare Airport, becoming somebody who loves the city and wants to be a booster for it just like you are. So thank you for all your support. You know, one of the joys of being a historian is that you get to begin any presentation with a story. And today I was asked to talk a little bit about museums and the impact of 9/11 and talk a little bit about the Chicago Historical Society. But let me really begin by talking about the importance of history and what I learned, where the greatest lesson I got about the importance of history. Early in my career, when I was at the Smithsonian, I was asked to lead a major project. It was a project that was going to become a book and a major exhibition on the history of the 19th century. And as part of that, they asked me to see if I could find the story of slavery somewhere that we could tell it at the Smithsonian. And so they asked me if I could find a slave cabin. So I went down to South Carolina and was told that there was some extant slave cabins in a place called the Waccamaw Neck near Georgetown, South Carolina. Now, you've got to imagine this. I'm dressed like a typical historian of 15 years ago. Tweed jacket with those ugly patches, loafers that just didn't look good even 15 years ago. And that basically, I had to go back into the swamp to see this slave cabin. And when I was there, they introduced me to a man, Mr. Johnson. He was 94 years old, and he had lived in the slave cabin with his slave grandmother. So he was going to tell me all these wonderful stories. So we start in the front of the cabin, and he talks about how the slaves, like his grandmother, would sweep the ground so hard to get rid of all the grass so there'd be no bugs or vermin. And then we'd walk to one side of the cabin, and he'd talk about how the kids would sort of watch the chimney to make sure it didn't fall or catch fire. And we walked to the back of the cabin, and we talked about how slaves grew all their food back there. And then I walked to the fore side of the building, and he wouldn't come. And I said to him, Mr. Johnson, why don't you come over here and explain to me what happened? He wouldn't move. I said, Mr. Johnson, please, I've come all the way from Washington. I thought I'd impress him. Came all the way from Washington to learn about this. And I said, why won't you come here? He said, because, son, there are rattlesnakes over there. So, I really did move fast. I said to him, why didn't you tell me that there were rattlesnakes there? And he said to me, he said, everybody around here knows the history of that spot. And son, if you're not smart enough to know how important history is, then I'll let you step into rattlesnakes by yourself. And I've never forgotten that, because in some ways, That's what we do. The Chicago Historical Society is really a place that helps to give you, the public, the kind of historical information, historical data that allows you not to step into the pits of the rattlesnakes, that allows you to use the past effectively as a tool to get perspective, a tool to help think about your life, a tool to help you discover the paths that you need to take using history to help you become the kind of individual and for Chicago to become the kind of city that we want it to be. Let me begin by talking a little bit about what we've learned and what's been the impact for museums of the tragedy of 9/11. I think, first of all, it's important to remember that museums, like all of America, were stunned by what happened on 9/11. But I think what happened is, like every corporation, every educational entity, every government entity, museums have been really struck and stunned by what happened. Suddenly, Americans found themselves in a dramatically altered landscape, where long-held assumptions about security, about peace, about the nature of war were all called into question by what happened on September 11th. And ultimately, confidence was suddenly replaced by vulnerability, and certainty gave way to doubt. The confluence of international terrorism and an already weakened economy presented the nation with unprecedented challenges, and museums found themselves snared up in that shadow of uncertainty. Museums have found themselves both struggling as a result of September 11th, but also they've found some positive opportunities that I'd like to talk about. The attacks of September 11th contributed mightily to the economic downturn that has hit America's museums. The decline in tourism, the impact of lessening tax revenues, and the continuing downward slide of the market all contributed to what one scholar has called the rockiest period ever for nonprofit art organizations. Museums in New York alone lost $28 million in just the 2 weeks after September 11th. Museums in cities like Washington or Chicago or Los Angeles lost millions due to the decline in tourism. At the Smithsonian Institution, my old home, attendance dropped 47% for the first 6 months after 9/11. And even today, attendance is 25% lower at the Smithsonian than it was this time a year ago. And those numbers are the same at the Metropolitan in New York, and even the Museum of Fine Art in Los Angeles suffers from this decline that people tie to 9/11. As one national booking agency told me when I asked them about what are the trends you're finding in tours and in school groups, he said to me, even school groups are not booking trips to places where they always went because there's a concern about security. And he said, like many of us, all I hope is that next year is better. But even more troubling to us is not just the attendance, but it really is the volatility of the market. Because as the market retracts, every museum who used the wonderful growth over the last decade suddenly finds itself stuck. We became comfortable with that growth. We began to use that money to finance core projects. And suddenly, that growth is gone. What happens? It makes it very difficult for institutions that are cultural institutions like museums to really plan what is their effective future. But even more importantly for me, this volatility casts a pall on individual and corporate philanthropy. Nationally, every museum finds that the number of individual donors has remained the same, but the amount that they give and the frequency with which they give has changed dramatically since 9/11. And some corporations have rightly given their support to the rebuilding of New York or Washington or to victims' families. What's interesting to those of us that work in museums is that the numbers suggest that 39% of individuals and corporations who give to help New York City or Washington, D.C. will not give anywhere else. So in a way, that 39% is taken away from what museums traditionally use as part of their philanthropy. Now, I'm not saying that it's a choice of New York or museums, but I think it's important that we recognize that it's a very different environment that museums find themselves in as a result of September 11th. Yet I would argue all is not negative. In fact, when you look at the press, the stories the press always talks about is layoffs and declines. But I would argue that 9/11 has also provided an opportunity for museums to begin to redefine themselves, to begin to reposition themselves, to begin to think about what role they ought to play in this society. I would argue that 9/11 has really allowed museums to begin thinking about how they create opportunities that allows them to be places of reflection, of healing, of meaning for the American public. I would argue that especially with history museums, 9/11 has challenged history museums to find a way to be a source of historical knowledge that can be helpful tools as people wrestle through times of despair and times of uncertainty. And because of this thinking, there have been a dizzying array of programs and ideas that museums have put forth to try to help the American public. In Texas, for example, the Austin Children's Museum, one of the largest children's museums in the country, put together a list, a long email list of people who had children because they realized that children were traumatized by what they saw on television. And so they actually put together information that went to parents to help them think about how do you talk to your children about tragedy or difficult times. They also created online chat rooms to help parents explore what they need to do to help their children successfully grapple with this difficult issue. And also places like the St. Louis Science Center led the way with things that museums have never done before, like creating blood drives that were housed in the institution. But other institutions did things more traditionally, like we did at the Chicago Historical Society. What we did was we crafted a series of programs culminating in a kind of standing room only town meeting that was called September 11th, Reflections on a Changed America. And the point is that that event that occurred 2 weeks after the attack really did set a pattern that we're going to try to follow for many, many years. Working with churches, universities, and the media, we put together a program that had a diverse array of people, from people like Carol Marin to Studs Terkel to scholars and historians on the Middle East. And what this did is this gave the public who came to that event a very important opportunity, more than we ever imagined. It gave the public an opportunity to ask basic questions about the Middle East or bin Laden, but it also gave people an opportunity to share passion, anger, and pain. And at the end of the meeting, one of the visitors came up to me and said, "This is what I expect from a Chicago Historic Society, to give me the past as a tool to help me understand what I'm going through right now." And in a way, we want to build on that, because I think that's one of the ways cultural institutions like ours can really be of value. Other institutions like the Smithsonian, the New York Historical Society, are all working on major exhibitions to open next September to help us think about this event. But even we at the Historical Society, we are working on a variety of programs for next September. Part of those programs will be exhibitions. We have the photographic collections of the Magnum photographers who were in New York for a meeting the day before, and they quickly documented September 11th. But we also had, thanks to some of the good people on my staff, we documented Chicago. How did Chicago commemorate? What were the posters and the banners that were put out and the way flags were used? So we'll do an exhibition that explores all that, as well as a series of programs that'll help us continue to reflect both on the event and how we commemorate that event. While American museums, candidly, are still adjusting, still struggling, trying to figure out how they will do well, how they will come to grips with September 11th. I would argue that it's too early to tell exactly what will happen, because even though attendance is back up, and even though there is giving that people are being able to build upon, it's not near where the level where it was or where most institutions thought it would be. But while I can't talk about the future of other institutions, what I can do is talk a little bit as quickly and as briefly as a historian who is very rarely brief can do. I think that I'd love to have the opportunity to talk about the Chicago Historical Society because, in all honesty, as Jay said, when I came here, I felt this was one of the special jewels in America. In some ways, the Chicago Historical Society was like a prophet without honor in its own land. That there was a core of people in the city that loved it, but those of us outside the city knew it was a special place, knew it had done innovative work for generations. And so when I came, I was so flattered and honored to have a chance to run what is clearly one of the nation's premier history museums. So then the challenge is, when you come here, what do you want to accomplish? What do you want to do? Now, my staff sitting over here has heard this many times, but the key for me is we want to be the best history museum in America. It's that simple. Now, we may have to settle for second place to the Smithsonian, but I'm not sure yet. I want to give the Smithsonian a run for their money. But the goal is to say, how can we be a place that is a world-class institution that the city of Chicago deserves? As Jay said, I came here in part because this is a city that is immersed in its history. This is a city that loves who it was, who it is, and who it will be. And I wanted to be a part of a place that I knew could support history, an institution like the Chicago Historical Society. So my hope is that the passion the city has for its past, the great traditions of the Historical Society, and the ideas we have will be a wonderful marriage to continue to move the Historical Society to the place and to the level where I think we all want it to be. I would argue that being the best history museum in the country means a couple of things. It means that we will strive to be a place that celebrates and sustains history, a place of song, of music, of laughter, and of meaning. The Chicago Historical Society is committed to being both a place of enrichment, but also a place of education. And to do this, I would argue, we have to successfully wrestle with 5 challenges that really will shape the future of the Historical Society. I think the first challenge, candidly, is how do we as a museum build on the wonderful traditions of the Chicago Historical Society, but how do we make sure we're not held captive by those past traditions? For example, one of the Chicago's Historical Society's greatest strengths is its wondrous collections. One of the things I don't get a chance to do enough of is to just wander into the storage rooms or go out to where we store the millions of objects that we have. But everyone is stunned when I tell them of the array of things we have. So our challenge is, how do we make the millions of photographs, the millions of objects accessible and meaningful to the millions of people in the city and this region? While we can do it through traditional methods like exhibitions, we also have to look at new partnerships. In all honesty, the goal of the Historical Society can't simply be, come inside our doors. It also has to be, how do we reach out and ensure that our stories are throughout this city, throughout this region? So the notion of collaboration, whether it's with the Chicago Public Libraries, the Chicago Public Schools, with the Architectural Foundation, the goal is to say, we have the stories, we have the stuff, we want to share with you. So our goal is to figure out, how do we really break out of the traditional mold of what a history museum is? And also, how do we utilize technology to do that? What's the role of making things accessible on the web? And trying to find the balance between letting people have images, but encouraging people to see the real things, because we know the power of the real object. I would argue it also means that the Chicago Historic Society has to always remember to play to its strengths. And one of our strengths is that we have one of the greatest collections of Abraham Lincoln material in the country. So why not have a permanent gallery on Abraham Lincoln? All these tourists that come to Illinois, the one thing they all see is the picture of Lincoln on a license plate. And so it seems to me one of our challenges is to make sure that we capitalize on those strong collections that we have. But another of our traditional strengths that we really want to build upon is our work with the neighborhoods. I would argue that the Historical Society was the pioneering institution in this country when it came to working with neighborhoods, crafting exhibitions collaboratively, not telling a community what its history is, but working with that community to tell the story, whether it was the story of Pilsen or Bronzeville or Rogers Park. We have done wonderful shows that explore that, and we will always continue to do that. But the challenge is, how do we do exhibitions that cut across neighborhoods? Because the truth of the matter is, no one has the resources to do every neighborhood in Chicago. And more importantly, part of the story of Chicago is not simply the neighborhoods, but the interaction amongst neighborhoods and amongst different people. So how do we do that? How do we cut across that? Well, we've got some ideas on how to do that. And just one example of that is a major initiative that we're working on. And it's an initiative that will culminate in a major exhibition on the history of being a teenager in Chicago over the last 100 years. And what this will do is it'll begin as an educational program. What we've done is we've chosen 15 schools from around the city and the region, very diverse schools. And these kids will come to the Historic Society this summer and be trained in how to do oral history, how to think about museums, how to read and write in stronger ways, and that in essence, they will begin by interviewing their peers about what is teenage culture in Oak Park? What is the music? What is the dress? What is the language? Well, what is the language? But we'll also know what is that culture then in Bronzeville, and what's the culture in Evanston? And we want to take that, and then these kids will begin to interview kids outside of their schools to craft this sense of what being a teenager is. And we will do, unlike traditional exhibitions which begin in the past and then in the present, we will begin in the present and use the contemporary teenager as a way to go back into history. And the one thing we know is that all of us may be glad that we're not teenagers again, but we all remember it. And so in a way, part of what we want to do is use the teenage experience, not as a way to celebrate teenagers, although what we hope is this will be a way that teenagers will also begin to think about museums as places where they can actually come to visit, to see themselves. But we want to use it, like so much, as a lens to simply understand the history of Chicago through many different lenses. So that kind of a show really allows us to really challenge ourselves in non-traditional ways. I would argue the second challenge the Historical Society faces is to elevate the visibility and the place of the Chicago Historical Society in the hearts and minds of this city and this region. In some ways, Chicago Historical Society is viewed as this wonderful entity, an entity that the city reveres. And it's an entity that we're very honored to have the city's trust, because in essence, the Historic Society is your collective memory. But we also want to be more than that. We want to be more than venerated, we want to be visited. And so one of the challenges is to really say, how do you take what is a venerated institution and make sure it is something that kids, teenagers, adults, families all want to come visit? And that's what we wrestle on, because we want it to be for you a place that not only do you recall your visit in 6th grade or 9th grade, or a place that you recall because you went to a wonderful evening event. We also want it to be a place that has meaning for you in its exhibitions, in its public programs. I would argue that for us, the goal is to increase this visibility in several ways. The first, and maybe the most important, is through important and interesting exhibitions. A good example is the current exhibition that Jay talked about, The American Presidency, A Glorious Burden, an exhibition that I was fortunate enough to work on at the Smithsonian. This is the kind of exhibition I expect us to produce at the Historical Society on a regular basis. It is an exhibition that looks at an important subject. What more than today, should we know, what subject more than today than the American presidency is something that we ought to think about and understand its history. But it's also an exhibition that's ripe with wonderful objects, whether it is the inkstand that Abraham Lincoln used to write the Emancipation Proclamation, or a life mask from the Chicago Historical Society's collections of George Washington, or a microphone used by Franklin Roosevelt to give his fireside addresses. But it's also an exhibition that in some ways is rich visually. And so what we really want to do is take exhibitions that are going to be multi-layered and interesting and use those as one of the ways we get people to begin to look to the Historical Society. And just to give you an example of some of the things we're working on. Next year at this time, we're working to open a major exhibition on the history of sports in Chicago. Seems to me a no-brainer. But it's also an exhibition that'll let us look at regionalism in the city, Cubs fans versus White Sox fans. And we think it'll be a very popular show. We're also doing a major exhibition on the history of Catholic Chicago, looking at what does that mean for this city's history? And what does it mean for the diversity within the city? As well as exhibitions on the African American church. So in a way, we're looking at crafting these kinds of exhibitions that we hope will be of interest to a wide array of people. And it also means, candidly, for us to be successful, that we have to do something that some of the museums in the city do very well, but most museums don't, and that is marketing. We need to recognize that we could have the greatest story ever told, but if you don't market it, nobody's going to come. And so our challenge is to figure out how, as a cultural institution, we market ourselves better. And that's why I hope some of you have begun to see on the buses of the CTA signs that say the American Presidency, Glorious Burden. We're really trying to find different ways to get that story out. But also, one of the biggest challenges we face is the fact that we have to reconceptualize and re-envision the exhibitions and the building that is the Chicago Historical Society. While we are a place of history, and we revel in that fact, it's crucial that our exhibitions and our facilities don't look old. And it's important for us to take this opportunity to re-envision the entire Historical Society. And that's what we're doing. We're in the midst of reconceptualizing space and new exhibitions. We're trying to figure out what's the role of technology in exhibitions. We're looking to craft exhibitions with engaging design that will appeal to a broad range of visitors. We're looking to find ways that you can utilize technology to go deeper into the history. For example, one of the things that we're going to do is you're going to be able to, hopefully both on the web and in the building, actually go and pick a neighborhood in Chicago. And through technology, look at it, how it's visually changed over the last 100 years. So you'll pick State Street, and you'll be able to look at it in the 1890s, or you'll look at it in 1920, or you'll look at your particular community, ways to give people a way to understand that this city has changed over time. But I also think one of the greatest challenges we face is that with all these dreams, the biggest challenge for us is, what are the resources? Where are you going to get the resources to do the work you want? Where I grew up in a small town in New Jersey, our one gas station had a big sign that said, "Cash makes no enemies, let's be friends." So what I'm doing is looking for friends throughout this city. We're looking for friends who begin to think of the Historical Society as the kind of place that you want to support, as the kind of place that really is both the wonderful small gem that you remember, but it's also a place of possibility and change. And we need that kind of support to help us become both a venerated institution, but an institution that is engaging, interactive, and highly visible. Ultimately, it seems to me that the Chicago Historical Society, like museums generally in this country, are really at a wonderful moment. A moment when it's time to rethink who it is, but to never lose track of the traditions that have made you great. And finding that tension is where we are. The tension between remaining the same and the tension of change. And so in a way, I would argue that this is probably one of the most exciting times to be at the Chicago Historical Society. Because in some ways, this is a cultural institution that has always worked. And so our job is to make it work a little better. Ultimately, if we are successful, what the Chicago Historical Society becomes is a place that really is of value to the city in many ways. It's a value as your collective memory. It's a value as the place that you sort of can see pieces of history, touch the true cross, if you will. But it's also a value because it's a place that gives you meaning, that allows you to find enrichment, that allows you to find the opportunity to immerse yourself in the past, to learn from it, and to share that knowledge with future generations. I would argue that there is nothing stronger than a people or a nation who are steeped in their history. And there is nothing nobler than creating the opportunities for people to remember. And if we're lucky, the Chicago Historical Society will always be a place that helps you grow, learn, and remember. Thank you.
Uncle Tom, stay there. You stay there.
Thank you.
He's looking at you. Lonnie's going to take some questions. As I mentioned, we're on cable TV, so if you go to that microphone, state your question, and he'll state your name and your question, and it's up to you.
Thank you. My name is Nance Dulay. I write for the Southwest News Herald, the West Lawn area, and I'm also with the Commission on Human Relations. It's not a double debate thing. I wanted to know, because I have been a member for many years and have attended the 4th of July celebration, and I was wondering, and it's wonderful, I was wondering if you already have slated a speaker and a reader of the Declaration of Independence.
I think that reading the Declaration of Independence gets to be my job, but we're also now trying to finalize who the speaker will be. We always like to sort of wait till the last minute on that because we like the pressure. But I think that we will know very soon who that speaker will be.
Thank you.
Dr. Bunch, I'm Joyce Saxon, as you know. Could you illustrate for us the difference between working for an institution as enormous as the Louvre, namely the Smithsonian, which always scares me, and working here? Is it easier here, or is it more difficult because there are less resources?
I think well, that's a hard question. In some ways, candidly, it's harder to run the Chicago Historical Society than to run the Museum of American History, and let me explain why. In a place like the Museum of American History, where my staff alone was 360 people, what happens is that, therefore, you are able to get a lot of ideas, a lot of creativity, and part of your task is really juggling an embarrassment of riches. One of the challenges of the Chicago Historical Society is that it's got such great staff, but it's a small staff. And so what you have is a lot of people that are carrying on a lot of things. And as my staff knows, I like people. I always promise my staff, you work for me, you'll never be bored. You guys bored? Okay. And so one of the challenges is to take a staff and to figure out what's the right balance between too much that you have on their plate and not enough to make the kind of change. I'll tell you what the big difference is for me between Washington and here. I think it's really two. I would argue that here, unlike the Smithsonian, there is a great commitment to a local community. The Smithsonian has no community. It doesn't pay any attention to Washington, D.C. It's got a national. I've always said at the Smithsonian, I could put anything on the floor and 7 million people will come see it. So that what you have here is a commitment to this city, to sharing its history, to bringing the passion and the love they have for it to a broader public. And that makes it very special. I go away every day after working with these people just amazed at their commitment and amazed at their love of the city. And I think the other major difference is that in a place like the Chicago Historical Society, what you really have is the challenge to help people see that where they are is great, but they can also be greater. And I think that's one of the differences at the Smithsonian. Because the Smithsonian, the arrogance is such that we're the best thing going and we don't have to be better than anybody else because we're already there. And I love the joy that my staff has of working harder to be the best institution they can be.
Dr. Bunch, my name is Hal Burke. What is the role of the Chicago Historical Society as a repository of memorabilia, less than the dramatics of its Abraham Lincoln collection, as part A of the question? And secondly, it is a repository of a vast amount of historical material dealing with the City Club of Chicago. How does anybody know that this club has deposited great historical materials with the society?
Let me answer your question in the order that you posed it. I think in some ways, the Chicago Historical Society is a place that really cares about the city's history in the fullest range. So one of the things that really has separated this institution is that over the last 20 years, it has really made sure it explored the history of the mayor, as well as the history of the person that swept the streets. So in some ways, one of the joys of the Historical Society is that it really can provide a fuller picture of the city of Chicago than, say, the New York Historical Society can, for example. And I think that's one of its strengths. I think one of the challenges for us is that when we acquire a collection, first of all, there are announcements about those collections being acquired, and then on many of our finding aids, people are able to easily find out what collections we have. And as more of those are online, it makes it easier for the public to know what we do. The other challenge is, candidly, we want to continue to acquire records like the City Club, and we have to always struggle with the challenge of acquiring records and the need to publicize that, maybe through exhibitions, and the fact that we don't always have the resources to do the kind of major stories that we would like to around each collection. But I think it's our commitment to let the world know what we have in our holdings.
Steve Abbey, I'm part of Bank One, that's a lifelong Chicagoan. Welcome to our city.
Thank you.
Glad you're here. Hope you stay a long time. Being a lifelong Chicagoan and also a big sports fan, I have great interest in your upcoming exhibits you talked about. And let's presume for a moment, and I'm also a big fan of history, let's presume for a moment that I have such great interest in your sports exhibition that I would like to be a contributor, a sizable contributor. This is where it really gets fanciful. And,
Well, I was about to say, come sit right here.
But I want to substantially underwrite the cost of that exhibition. But you know what? In this town, I think the White Sox have really been getting a short shrift in terms of the media. I think the Cubs have a media machine behind it. So I'd really like you to more fully emphasize the White Sox. So in general, how do you deal with a willing, substantial donor, or how have you, or how will you deal with a willing, substantial donor who wants to influence the content of the
I think one of the things a cultural institution has to be willing to do is to walk away. I think that candidly, we are a place of history. And that means that if the word got on the street that you could buy the interpretations of the Chicago Historical Society, we would lose so much that it wouldn't be worth doing the one exhibition. My argument is that what we learned at the Smithsonian, if you've been following some of the joys of the Smithsonian in terms of donors, one of the things that we've learned is that the first thing one has to do is emphasize truth. To begin to talk to donors about, here's what we're trying to do. Here's the directions we want to go. We want to hear your take, because obviously we don't have a monopoly on wisdom. But we really need to make sure that before you consummate a deal, that it's really clear what you're buying, and it's clear to us what the expectations are. I think that you've put your finger on what is the biggest challenge, I would argue, museums face, because it's a different era. When I started in museums, except in art museums, donors never, ever raised questions about what you wanted to do. While they may have raised it in a first discussion, once you basically signed the contract, you did what you needed to do. And it's a different era. And you know what? Institutions are better for that, because the argument I make is this new relationship means that we've got to be able to explain ourselves. We've got to be able to just be really clear with what the expectations are, and that's best for everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That-
Thank you.